Our resident lawyer Despina Priala of boutique law firm Priala Legal in Runaway Bay is with us every Thursday to offer her legal expertise by providing general advice on the latest hot topics. She has experience spanning more than 25 years in the area of property and commercial law, and she joins us right now. Good morning, Despina.
Morning, Despina.
Good morning, Brooke. Good morning, Wayne.
Well, this...
what a week.
What a week. What a week. Now, of course,
yes, indeed.
Over the last couple of weeks here in the northern rivers of New South Wales, the lockdown has come to us. We saw it coming closer and closer and closer over the weeks, and finally it has arrived. And certainly lots of people are very unhappy about the situation at the moment.
Yes, look, I really feel for the people on the border, to be honest, and I really sympathise with what's happening and the business owners and the families that are facing this chaos that I have to call. What's happening on the border is just terrible, and I say that because in my view, and I think it's a view held by many, if not all, is that the Queensland and New South Wales border is the busiest border in Australia. It is a very unique border that sets it apart from every other border around Australia. Would you not agree?
That's true,
100%.
Yes. Yeah, the closest would be Albury-Wodonga, but that's a fraction of the size of where we are here on the Queensland-New South Wales border, yeah.
That's right. So being so unique of itself, and unique in the point with respect to businesses being right on the border, right next to each other, it's a hub of activity. And these people are being greatly affected by these border restrictions. And that's why we say it is quite unique for them to have to deal with this. And the border restrictions in place that we've seen for some time are blanket border restrictions that apply, we've seen with other borders. So perhaps the question is, really, shouldn't New South Wales, Queensland border be looked at in a different way, in a unique way, because of the economy, because of the hub of activity, and because of the extent of the businesses and families that are feeling the impact and effect of these restrictions?
Yeah, of course. And we've seen local MPs, we've had them on the show this week, and they're discussing all these different ways that we can see some sort of change, whether it's a petition to move the border south or create this bubble again. But nothing has given in. We have premiers that obviously aren't agreeing or not doing anything. So, yeah, where does that leave us, really, as the public?
It is. And movement, I agree with. I'm not sure about the protests. I mean, that's a separate issue. And I saw what's happened, and I feel for the people. And as I said, I can see the frustration. And I suppose the reasoning behind let's do a protest as to how the protest was carried out and what happened in the end is a different thing altogether. But the underlying reasoning and the frustration for voicing your opinion through a protest, for example, I can understand that to a certain extent, because if we look back at where we have come from to where we are now, and we've done this before with previous discussions on the show. So we've had this, COVID-19 emergency response disaster situation being declared a state of emergency or state of disaster in various states and territories around Australia, and then laws that have been passed. Now, these laws that have come into place, they have come into place to amend existing laws. So in Queensland in particular, we've had the Public Health Act out since 2005, and we've actually had an act called the Disaster Management Act that's been out since 2013. So when in Queensland it was declared a state of emergency, these new laws and regulations that came out to amend existing laws. But the way that laws are usually passed, these laws that came out to deal specifically with the COVID-19 disaster situation were passed in a different way. So they were passed in a way that normal laws weren't passed, in that laws are usually passed through Parliament, takes a process and takes time, and the laws are there scrutinised, and there are checks and balances, and sometimes the laws are passed, sometimes they're not. Sometimes there are amendments proposed, sometimes they're not. And it does take time for new laws to be put through that process to be scrutinised, where checks and balances are done through Parliament. These laws weren't. So these regulations were passed to deal with an emergency situation, and the Chief Medical Officer was granted extensive powers to make directions and orders in an emergency situation. But when I've looked at these laws, the intention was always to deal with a short period of time.
Yeah.
So if we go back, nobody could imagine or envisage where we would be 18 months down the track.
Well, the other question is, of course, when you introduce new laws in any of our parliaments, as you say, there's scrutiny and there's also an opposition. Now, what about the opposition both at state level and federal level here when it comes to these particular laws? We've heard very little opposition at all about anything, really. It's all just, through you go, it's all good.
Well, that's right. So these laws were amended specifically to give the Chief Medical Officer these powers. So when I talked about the checks and balances and laws being scrutinised, that's pretty much gone out the window. So these laws were allowed to apply and be exempt, I suppose, from that usual process that we see. So that is something that people need to be aware of. And of course, the Chief Medical Officer will obviously say, well, these laws were required to come out instantly to deal with an emergency situation that we all had to deal with. And perhaps that might be so in the initial period. Mm-hmm. But also we found under the Public Health Act that was amended by these laws back in April last year, there's a section 362B, and in that section under the Public Health Act, which is a new section, it allows these directions to be made for a short period of time, but it then also allows the Chief Medical Officer with those powers to extend those laws to continue for as long as she or he reasonably believe it is required, which is exactly what we've seen, isn't it, in the last 18 months.
And how long, so you say when they're allowed to be extended, how long are they extended for?
Until such time as they no longer see those laws as necessary. So again, it's a very wide discretionary power that is given to the Chief Medical Officer in these circumstances. And it's these laws aren't black and white either. And the other issue I have with not just laws being black and white and having to be interpreted, it's who has to interpret those and who has to enforce them.
Yeah.
And it's difficult, and that we've seen through society as well, because we have this act also allowing the Chief Medical Officer to delegate the enforcement of these directions and orders, which are laws, to other various people that are called emergency officers. So that's why you've got people like the police force out there who are trying to and have to enforce these laws, that are finding it perhaps difficult, if I can say, on their behalf, that because the laws aren't black and white. Yep. They're grey.
And they're also changing so often as well. I really do look. Our men and women in blue do such a fantastic job under very trying circumstances to have all of this extra stuff, and yet these rules are changing constantly, and to be able to keep up, and then
it's almost impossible.
It's almost impossible. It's got to be.
Laws are supposed to be clear and concise and easily found and easily located so people can obey them. And that's basically the rule of law. And what we have here is we have anything other than a compliance with the rule of law, because we've got these directions and orders, which are laws, right? They're called directions, but they're laws that have come out to deal with an emergency situation. And there are laws that people have to easily find. Well, they're not. And over time, the government has changed how they're displayed on the website. Mm-hmm. You still have to find the information on the website, and they're not easily found in a PDF, for example. So you have to find the direction order, and then you've got to scroll through pages and pages and pages and pages on the website to actually understand what the directions are providing. And you're going all over the place because the directions refer to various definitions. Then you've got to find, well, where are the definitions? Then you've actually got to find there's a schedule at the bottom of the directions in Queensland, which talks about, well, let's give you a table and a schedule for you to understand whether you are on a border resident trying to come back in, if you haven't come from a COVID hotspot. So there are a range of things to deal with, and people have to read through that and navigate, particularly, as I said before, law enforcement officers. And you really have to be a lawyer, in my view, to read these and understand, interpret, to then apply and enforce these laws. And really, the question is that really fair for people such as police officers and other people?
Yeah, yeah. And on top of that as well, we even have lovely, beautiful callers that are of a mature age. They don't even have a computer. And then they're sitting on the phone for 2 hours straight trying to get an answer. And then and like you said, there's emergency. There's New South Wales services on the other line going, and I've experienced this in my own household, going, that's how I interpret it. Yeah. So like you said, it's almost open to interpretation, which is just so distressing for everyone.
It's been called a dog's breakfast, Despina.
Absolutely. And the rule of law is, as I said, the rules are supposed to be clear, concise, so people can easily follow and obey them. And how is that possible? The way that they are drafted, the way that they're displayed or not displayed, or easily or not easily found by members of the public and emergency officers. And then those emergency officers, what resources do they have, for example, to help them interpret these laws? You know, I have to wonder that too. And what are they doing about that? And at whose cost? Because, as I said, being a lawyer, I can read through this and it would take me time, but I will understand it, I think, to a large extent. But I have to query whether most people would understand it. And then that's why I suppose maybe it's one of the reasons people get to the border and then they're turned back, because they thought they could cross, but then they find that they can't. And then maybe the enforcement officers get it right. Maybe they don't.
Yeah.
It's not really their fault because of the way that the laws are written. To understand, as you said, laws are constantly changing. Yep. They're being updated. How do we know? The only way that you could really find out is you've got to actually subscribe, which I've done. So there's a link on the website that says subscribe to Public Health Orders Update. So if you actually subscribe and you put your email address in, then you will get updated. Because remember, there are fines that are issued and can be issued, penalties that can apply to people who don't obey with those laws. So when you look at it holistically, really, is it fair and equitable? And also with those fines, the fines can be substantial. They could go up to, I think, 13,000 or more maximum fine for non-compliance. So again, it's also, how are these penalties, for example, being enforced? How is someone supposed to determine, well, how much of a fine do I issue? Depending on what's not being enforced. For example, is it a $100 fine or is it a $13,000 fine? For example.
Just lastly, Despina, I wonder whether you could use that perhaps as the basis for a lawsuit, if, or at least for your defence if you ended up taking it to court. Sorry, it was just not clear at all, and therefore it's not legal, and therefore
compensation.
I'm not guilty.
Potentially. I'll always say there's always a potential for at least someone to look into the situation and see if that is a possibility. And on that point, I suppose I can say, and I found it quite interesting reading through all these laws, is that the COVID-19 Emergency Response Act that was brought into play in April last year in Queensland to amend these existing laws specifically says at the beginning of the Act, which is very important because the beginning of Acts usually talk about how to interpret the Act. And it says in Section 4 there that these laws apply despite any other act in force, which is pretty powerful. But it then goes on to say, other than the Human Rights Act. So the Human Rights Act is a very powerful piece of legislation. And people need to understand and know that, and perhaps that can be used in the future somehow.
So in the long term, what do you think as a lawyer should happen?
Well, that's a bit of a tough question because,
it's messy, I know, yeah.
Well, yes, I think in my view, though, enough is enough in terms of these directions that are continuing and continuing and continuing to be extended and extended. And I have to query whether there's been careful consideration given for this unique situation that we have at the moment on the Queensland-New South Wales border. And it is unique and it's messy and there's chaos every day. And I don't know whether there's been proper consideration given for these continual extensions to be in place indefinitely, it would seem, for this situation that we're dealing with. And I think something has to change.
Stick around, because up next we will be talking to Despina about a question that was sent in from a listener named Margaret regarding photos of her property when it went on sale. Does she own them? Does she not? We'll find out coming up next.